Okay, we're ready to go. So I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of the Stonewall National Museum, Archive, and Library based in Fort Lauderdale. Everyone is welcome to come. We have 3 exhibits up. We are getting ready to celebrate our 50th anniversary with a gala taking place here in Fort Lauderdale on February 25th. For information, you can go to our website, stonewall-museum.org. One of the programs that we're working on for this month, which is Black History Month, is on the 18th, Saturday the 18th. We're doing a program with a group of people from Kenya who have been displaced from other countries in Africa because they are LGBTQ, and they now are in a UN camp in Kenya where neither the UN troops or the Kenyan police are protecting them, and any number of them have been murdered, raped, or beaten. And so we are going to have a conversation with them at 11 a.m. Eastern time on February 18th. Anyone who wants to participate can find that information probably on our website. If not yet, it will be. So please, please, please join us. It's a really important conversation to have as democracies fight for survival around the world. Our very existence is often in the mix because we do better when there's freedom and the opportunity to participate in government. We do less well when that opportunity is stifled or absolutely put out. Today, I am really quite excited. We have Ryan Pfluger, who's holding space, Life and Love Through a Queer Lens book, which we will discuss, is probably one of the most appropriate works that are out there right now. Not only appropriate because of the interesting writing, but because of Ryan's photographs capturing a moment in time in lots of different people's lives that really does make us aware of where we are today. In Florida in particular, but other places as well, where you can't say gay, where you can't be woke, where you can't have books in a classroom, where you can be fired from your teaching job if you so mention that you're in a same-sex relationship. This book and the photos, and not sure if we have any of the photos to show, but it is spectacular in the sense that it shows mostly a variety of mixed race couples, transgender couples, women and women, men and men, but the gamut. And these are really kind of beautiful, beautiful people, mostly because they're captured at a moment when they're in love. And that brings something out in them that we don't often see. I mean, here's just one shot. I don't think I have the best light, but it just gives an indication of how intimate they are, the shots are, and because of the intimacy, how beautiful they are. So welcome, Ryan. And how did you come up with the idea in such troubled times? Because you conceptualized this when Donald Trump was president. For many LGBTQ plus people, that was not a comfortable time. It has evolved into a less comfortable time. So what sparked in you the desire to show love between young people across the United States?
Well, thank you for having me, first off. I think that, I say this is something that I've been kind of mulling over for about a decade or so. My first relationship that I ever had was an interracial relationship. And, I was 17 to about 23. And it wasn't until years and years later that I kind of realized how much I didn't understand about my partner, and that no matter how much that I loved them, I was still doing things that was hurting them, unconsciously. I think that now we're in a time where it's like to be uneducated about, systemic racism and patriarchy and stuff is kind of a cop-out if you aren't educated. But at that, the time that I was growing up, it was not something that I was really, I grew up in Flushing, Queens. I was the only white person on my block. I didn't understand a lot of the inherent things that people that didn't look like me were going through. And to experience that with someone that you love, it was something that I really kind of wanted to reckon with as an adult. And since then I had multiple relationships that have been interracial, and every relationship is always different than the last, as all relationships are. And so I really thought that it was something that I had never seen explored photographically, in a way that was really kind of taking a deep dive into the individualization of relationships, not treating any kind of marginalized group as a monolith, and understanding that, sometimes, and most of the time actually, love is what it is. And sometimes you can't help the person, help who it is that you love. A lot of times you don't have, the decision on who it is that you end up falling for. And so the idea of allowing couples to really kind of express what their stories were and really just listen, just be kind of a conduit for this conversation to happen. It ended up feeling most appropriate during COVID because I knew that it was going to be a time where people, one, needed connection with an outsider, and two, would also really be engaged with their partner, because that was pretty much who they were engaging with and the only person they were engaging with. So it felt like a real window into a specific period of time that would be kind of the most raw version of relationships. And I wanted to be able to document that, because I feel like, especially for queer people, there isn't, there may be photographic evidence, there may be, books about relationships, but there really hasn't been, as I learned when I was, dealing with publishers. A book like this hadn't existed before. And so to really honor that and honor kind of where we've come, where we're going, and kind of what we've been through, it just felt like the best time to do it.
And what did you learn about yourself from the experience?
It felt like the more I went through it, the less I knew. And I say that in a very positive way. I always felt, as a queer photographer and someone that has always photographed strangers and be really, really interested in that kind of first connection with someone, that I realized that I needed to listen more, that I needed to give more space to voices that weren't my own, that I could still be a part of the conversation, but maybe my opinions weren't necessarily the most important thing. And I feel like it really allowed me to take, an actual step back from myself and reevaluate the way I work as an artist. And it really has changed the way that I work as an artist. And
how has it changed that?
I'm really interested in the idea of like ethically driven photography, especially when it comes to marginalized groups. And, specifically with this, I didn't use model releases. No one was forced to be a part of this after I photographed them. It was really allowing space for it to be organic instead of the photographs have been taken, I'm sorry, like it is what it is, and people are going to see them. I really wanted to create a state, especially because, queer people in general don't feel like they have a ton of safe spaces. So as someone who is part of that community, it felt like it was my obligation to work in that way. And I've continued to do that within my practice of really, that I think artwork can always evolve even within the process of doing it, that nothing is set in stone. And then, you know, no one should, especially when it comes to their image and their, you know, very intimate, private thoughts, that should still be held sacred, and it should never be used in a way that feels inauthentic. And if someone, you know, we all change our minds all the time, and to allow the space for someone to change their mind, I actually think allowed people to feel more comfortable. You know, we talked about it a little bit before we started, of like couples that broke up, for them to still want to be included because they did feel like it was a safe space to be included. It didn't feel traumatic for them to allow, you know, those inner thoughts of what it felt like post-breakup, how their relationships have evolved or changed, for that to be part of the conversation.
And you mentioned that quite a number of them broke up, but you said in some respects you expected it, partly because they were young, partly because it was COVID, and partly because that's what happens to any number of relationships under the best of circumstances.
Yeah.
Were there any breakups that surprised you? And if so, why?
There's a few that have surprised me, like post-publication of the book, you know, about post it going to the printer. The couples that are in the book that wrote about their breakups or how their relationship has changed, those I wasn't quite surprised by. You know, I had a kind of like a running tally with my partner of like, you know, I'm a little unsure about this, but like, you know, because also, you know, there's about, I think it's about 25 or 30 couples that are not in the book, because they did break up or because they decided to no longer be a part of it. And a lot of those were surprises. And, you know, that was another thing that I knew going into it, but once it started happening, it was like, oh, this is actually really difficult as an artist to be so heavily reliant on other people and what their decision making is going to be, especially people that are not used to deadlines or, you know, that don't work in that capacity. So, you know, it was definitely a challenging experience, but it was not, it wasn't something that I went into not knowing that it was going to happen. It just kind of was like, when it was happening, it was a little frustrating.
And with people that are in love, at the moment you're taking their picture, how do you feel as you're approaching them? Some of them are unclothed, some of them are partially clothed. Some of them are in absolutely beautiful surroundings. Like the picture that I showed, they're in the water. I mean, they just look like they were meant to mold together. Do you ever feel that you're invading the privacy? Do you feel a part of the relationship, but outside it? I mean, what is the emotional feeling that you have at capturing that moment? Because these are not actors, they're not models. This is real life that you're taking a picture of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, especially when it comes with intimacy amongst queer people, just like historically kind of what the images that we're used to are very diaristic, not necessarily from an outsider because, you know, I think about 80% of these, or maybe more actually, were complete strangers when I met them. And to me, it very, you know, as a portrait photographer, I always say that photography is like therapy, and that's kind of how I always treat meeting strangers, that it's like, when you are meeting a therapist for the first time, it's like you're open to the idea of it, but you have to kind of suss out the situation if this is the right person for you, or like a first date. And I think that energy is really palpable, and it's very specific to that moment, which is why I work that way. Because after someone kind of gets to know you, it's like, or they know your work really well, there becomes different expectations and layers that exist in creating. So I never felt intrusive into the relationships because it was people that specifically reached out to me. Again, it was that kind of relinquishing of control. I was seeking people out, but I was allowing them to come to me instead of me coming to them. And the same thing with, being clothed or unclothed. I never had any requirements. I never had any expectations. I let it be a very collaborative process of what it was that they wanted or were comfortable in showing the world, of themselves. And that even came down to the final images that are actually in the book. All of the couples had final say on what was in the book. So again, that relinquishing and allowing kind of the control of narrative and voice to still be with the people I photographed was really important to me. So I didn't feel intrusive, because there's tons of images that I love that are not in the book, that I felt were more engaging or, intimate, or showed aspects of relationships that I thought were a little surprising, that the couples themselves weren't comfortable with, or they didn't feel like it would be the best version of themselves for them. And so that was really important to me. So I didn't feel like I was being intrusive into people's lives.
And what was the difference for you as the photographer? There are some people that are looking right at you, and sometimes it's even a couple where they're both looking at you, and sometimes they're looking at each other or they're looking away. Well, clearly those things just happened, but does that change the way you look at the situation when you're photographing? I mean, if you're being brought in because they're looking right into the camera versus that they're looking into each other's eyes, or they're looking away, almost as if they're pretending that you're not really there.
Yeah, it's, I think that, in some ways I treat the work I make very anthropologically, and in other ways I treat it really emotionally. And so, with understanding let me phrase it this way, 75% of what I do is reading people. And so it's like, I know when someone is going to be comfortable with really direct gaze and really, almost in a confrontational way, that doesn't feel aggressive, but it feels very like a statement. And, some people aren't. And especially with the images that were chosen by couples, I almost knew before they told me what they would be comfortable with because of what my interaction with them was. And I appreciate that there is that variety and variation of tone, because, coming from a very traditional portrait photographer background, the direct gaze is so important. It's so part of the dialogue. And I really enjoyed seeing the nuance of people that were hesitant about that gaze, especially as a queer person. I think that it's something that is also not really talked about, with the direct gaze and what it means historically, that, a lot of queer people are still not comfortable with that. They're not comfortable with that kind of vulnerability, because it is vulnerable to do that in front of the camera.
Is it because we're not used to being seen and we're used to hiding?
Absolutely. And especially being seen in this way, in a public way, it's like we may have, pictures with, our partners or with our lovers. A lot of times that remains private. Even with, the internet and social media and what we share, in a lot of places, even, places like, where I live in LA, it's like, there's a lot of people that have transplanted here from places where it was really not comfortable to be yourself, that it wasn't a safe space. And, finding that power in being seen doesn't happen overnight. And so for a lot of people, that's still something that is part of their evolution as a human, and understanding that it is safe to be seen when you're in a safe space. And to show that to the world is really important, because it then gives other people a place to look, to say, oh, look, there's something that looks like something I want, or there's my relationship that I live in the middle of, Nebraska, and I've never seen another couple in person that looks like my relationship. And that's really common. And so to allow this to exist where it's very accessible, that was really important part of the process.
Did you find a difference depending on location? Were New Yorkers different than people in LA? Were Northerners different than Southerners in terms of how they approached you or approached the project?
I would say in general, not necessarily. Because of the time constraints of this, I was not able to go as many places as I want. And there were a lot of the places that I did go ended up being couples that decided to no longer be a part of the work. That's one of the very interesting things of like when you're quote unquote trying to like check boxes of, oh, I have people in this place, I have people of this body type, I have people where, allowing that organicness of letting people just not be a part of it means that, the viewer doesn't see a lot of the other work that I made. And I think that, it's still in the end, it's a really interesting cross-section of relationships. And I think that this will be something that I continue doing throughout my artistic career as a continued documentation, because I would like to start making those kind of inferences on how relationships exist within different parts of the country in terms of like what their differences are and what things that they have faced within their family or social dynamics within specific locations, the South compared to the Midwest or compared to California or New York, because I think those are kind of complicated and nuanced conversations that people are not used to having and maybe aren't ready to have.
For those who dropped out, were they from one place or from another? Were people who were generally living in less safe places ultimately more uncomfortable about the exposure?
I don't want to make a general statement, but yes.
Yeah. And then we have a question. I know you spoke about this earlier, but everybody should know. It said, do you ask the subjects about which photo to publish, or do you choose?
The subjects, I like to say collaborators, because subjects feels like really like a hierarchy, and like this really wasn't that. But yes, they all had final say of all of the images that were published. They were some of the couples it wasn't that I like gave them choices. I said, this is the image that I really love, and are you comfortable with it? I'd say 50% of the time I would get the response of like, can we see other things? And then I would give them options, and then they would still have final say on what was used for the book.
When you set up a shot, are you capturing them at that moment? Did you set the shots, or did they find positions? Like you've got people laying on couches, you have people in the woods, you've got people leaning against trees, you have people leaning against each other, you have people that almost merge together. Was that just a progression and you captured many of those progressions, or did you subtly or intentionally ask them to move in certain ways or take certain positions?
Yeah, when it comes to locations, because, for about the first like 8 or 9 months that I was working on this, most places were still in lockdown in some capacity. So that meant outdoors. And so I gave all of the couples either a choice of you decide exactly where we go, or here's different kinds of locations that would, what do you find is the most attuned to your relationship or something you would do. And then once I was able to move into people's homes comfortably and safely, it was always up to them of like where we photographed, what room we photographed in. And when it came to the, posing, I'm a very quiet photographer in general. I will sit and kind of observe for a while before I even start taking photographs. I'll just listen if we're having a conversation. I don't really add much to it besides questions. And I use that time to really read people's body language and how they interact with each other. And then I play off of that because I can already see kind of what is making them comfortable and what, with any partnership, sometimes there's a person that leans more on the other, figuratively and, in actuality. And so, I really wanted to be cognizant of that. And that also played into a lot of the photographs that were chosen of, getting back to, these are all interracial couples and the racial dynamics in a lot of them, where, a lot of times the Black and brown partner felt that, that when they saw photographs with their partner, that a lot of times they felt like they were in the background or that they weren't necessarily the center focus or that they were being, comforted by their white partner. And that wasn't how they wanted to be depicted, even if it was something that they were doing themselves in the moment. Again, it comes to that, allowing people the choice where it's like, for me, I may not have had those perceptions looking at it because it's not my lived in experience. And so that's why it was really important for that decision-making to be, part of their process with me. And there's definitely a few photographs in the book that I was surprised by them being chosen for that reason, where I didn't necessarily think that it showed either partner in the light that I thought that they wanted to be seen in. But again, that's my perception of how I look at them and not how they look at themselves.
Yeah, that is always an interesting thing when you look at it and you see a great shot and they look at it and are not comfortable with it, and then vice versa.
Exactly. I'm coming from it from an artistic background and they're coming from it from a personal background. And it's, I think, going back to the like how I approach photography now and the idea of ethics and intent, especially when it comes to marginalized communities. I think that regardless of whether you're an insider or outsider, having these conversations with the people that you're photographing and allowing them to be a part of that process is really important, because it starts opening up doors to larger conversations. Because what someone's, I think I wrote about it in the introduction of that, even when I was looking at emails of couples that were emailing me, my partner had said, I thought you were only photographing queer couples. And I said, this is why I'm doing this, just by the visualization and what your perception of who these people were, and then thinking about that historically of how many things are taken out of context, and someone's true identity or feelings are not necessarily shown within a photograph. It's the photographer's or the artist's intent of what they're trying to show and what story they're trying to create. So I'm really trying to reevaluate how, especially when it comes to, you know, photographs of real living people, you know, what their image is going to, how it's going to exist historically, and for what the viewer will take away from it. So, you know, that's why I put out a book before even doing like a show of this work, because it was very important that the context of the text and what the couples had to say, and having the pronouns and having all of the things that were the indicators outside of the photograph itself. It was really important that that be the first introduction to this work.
Yeah, and I think that in this particular context, the pronouns make a difference because they inform what you're looking at and who you're looking at as they perceive themselves and as they present themselves to the public. What's also interesting is that sometimes the photo tells one story and then their words about their relationship and about themselves tell something very different.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of fascinating. Relationships that seemed very intimate in the photograph, and then when they talk, they're not necessarily talking together, they're talking as very, very unique, separate people.
Yeah.
About a relationship that almost doesn't necessarily even seem like it's the same relationship.
Yep. And I think that's I think that's kind of the real, just like, for me, what intrigued me and what I wanted to explore in the first place is just, especially with, you know, social media and how we present ourselves to the world, you know, that it can be a much different story than what is actually taking place. And, you know, I think, again, that dichotomy of it, you know, the image telling one story and the text telling another, I think that the one that always sticks out to me the most is that there's a breakup text, like a literal text message that was sent like the morning after that they had broken up. And that's what is, both of them wanted to be as the text for the book. And it's one of the hardest ones to read in the book. And the photograph of the two of them is them like laughing together in, you know, in a field. And that's the image they wanted to use, because there still was a lot of love there. But the reality of life, you know, is also another thing. And I think that it's really beautiful allowing those to exist at the same time.
Well, because it is interesting how you can, in relationships, you can grow together or you can grow apart, or you do both, and then make in some cases, a very conscious decision on how you're going to make this work, or if you're going to move on to something else. Or as we discussed earlier, it's not that relationships necessarily fail. They just change.
They just change.
And you grow through those experiences.
Absolutely. And, you know, I also think that it's really, you know, I know that growing up myself, I didn't have any, you know, couples to look up to or to have conversations with of what it's like building a relationship with a same-sex partner or with a trans partner or someone that doesn't look like me. And to, you know, have that information that's not, you know, a self-help book or a academic paper, that's just coming from real people and their real lived in experiences. You know, as someone that has worked in, you know, magazine world for almost 20 years now, I took that knowledge of like what it means to do, you know, long form journalism. And that's basically what this book is, of really allowing the voice though to be from the couples themselves. And, you know, you can take it as you wish. You can take it as like, oh, wow, I feel that, or I've experienced that, or like, I don't ever know what it will be like to experience that, but I'm glad for that information of knowing what that specific lived-in experience is like. And I can take that information into relationships that I have that aren't romantic or that are, and understand like maybe this is a conversation that I should have with this person. Because I even think just doing the book and the couples that reached out to me, that just doing this body of work with them forced them to have a lot of conversations that they weren't used to having with each other. And, you know, that, you know, coupled with COVID and just being just with each other, it felt like, you know, for some, unfortunately, you know, for some of the couples that I did photograph, a lot of them broke up within weeks of me photographing them, because it brought up things that they weren't talking about. And, you know, that information was relayed to me from them, and not in a like, I'm upset about this, but more like, wow, I didn't realize that I've been with this person for 5 years and didn't even realize, because I was prompting them. You know, there's lots of the conversation that we had that's not in the book because all of the words are firsthand words from them. But a lot of what they told me in privacy was stuff that they weren't used to talking about with each other.
And there are a lot, it's interesting once again, because there are those that talk about the racial differences and white privilege, or not having this experience or that experience, or some of them have international upbringing, which is vastly different than the white or people of color experience in the United States. And then others talk about their relationship.
Yep.
And the racial issues, the ethnic issues enter into the conversation far, far less. It doesn't necessarily seem that they don't have those conversations or have never had those conversations, but that they play a different part of their relationship.
Yep. And that, and, you know, and that's the other thing, is it's also what they wanted to be shared with the public, and whether or not, you know, it's something that's part of their relationship and the conversations they have. You know, what I allowed people to do was that I did, you know, because it's not a interview style or question prompts of forcing people to answer these kind of questions. I allowed the openness to be like, if you don't want to, all I want is for it to be personal. It doesn't matter what it is that you're speaking on. And sure, these are things that are going to be, and there's plenty of things that are in the book that I was really surprised people talked about, and
Right.
how they affected relationships, you know, of, you know, whether it was addiction or socioeconomics or things that they didn't necessarily reveal to me when I met them, but played a really integral role in their relationship. And again, it's like all of that unseen stuff. I was pleasantly surprised by the openness of a lot of people to revealing stuff that, you know, they didn't even reveal to me in private at the time.
Now, did a lot of those conversations come out after the photography?
Yes. So I had thought the way that the textual component came about, you know, I had thought a lot about like, well, am I going to record things while I'm photographing? Am I going to do this? Am I going to do interviews immediately after? And instead, I kind of waited until the majority of the couples were photographed, and I had time to really think on it. And I gave, some pretty general prompts and questions all at the same time to, I think it was about 80 or so couples, because I wanted to also be having those conversations with multiple couples at the same time and be able to kind of be like, oh, okay, like this couple is kind of revealing this, and this couple isn't really, they're kind of giving me some platitudes, and I already feel like I have stuff like this in the book. It was never, I never forced anything out of them, but there's definitely text in the book that I had to push people to get to, in a way that was respectful, but and also writing about yourself is not the easiest thing in the world, and a lot of people have not done that in a very long time.
And it's not always comfortable writing about your partner.
It's definitely
they're
not
going to read
by
it.
your partner. And then there was, some couples that really wanted their where their partner didn't see what they wrote, and where I would talk to them separately, because they wanted it to be a surprise for when it came out, or because they didn't want it to influence what they wrote about the other person. And I really wanted to respect those boundaries of people. And it was interesting to see how people just kind of went about talking about themselves, and what, given, free reign in a public platform to be able to do that, that's also not something that happens often, especially for, as we say, quote unquote, just like normal couples. And so I really wanted them to take away as much from that experience as possible for themselves.
Were there noticeably different relationships based on ethnicity or color or race or religion, or
Yes.
So there was what?
Yes.
Tell us.
I would say, because even when I was doing, open calls for people to reach out to me, there was a lot of people that were like, why are you doing a project on interracial relationships? Like, I'm a Black person, I'm never going to date a white person. And I said, just that preconceived idea that you think interracial is Black and white, is kind of why I'm doing this too. And it definitely was the interracial couples that were of two marginalized identities that, outside of being queer, that definitely were having much more complicated conversations and much more nuanced conversations than interracial couples that were just, a Black and white partner, or a Latino and white partner. And then especially also a trans partner who also was transitioning either when they met or after they met. Much more complicated conversations and much more intimate conversations were happening, that felt, not a lot of the more, couples that were just, a Black and white partner were still kind of having conversations that were a little, I don't want to say 101, but like a little surface level in terms of like bigger ideas. And then the other couples were having, where it was, things that I was even, surprised by, of the kind of just like the nuance that existed in those.
Can you give us an example?
Of just like understanding that, I'll just, in general, I'll just use like a generalization of like a Black and a Latino couple, of like the racism that is experienced is very different when they're separate and when they're together, and how people approach them is very different when they're separate or when they're together, and also just what their lived-in experiences were. And so it's like intersectionality in general, it's like once you start layering a whole bunch of, oppressive systems onto a person, and they're different for both people, it's like you're going to have very complicated conversations, where if you have a partner that's in pretty high privilege, besides being a queer person, maybe socioeconomics, the conversations aren't going to be as complex, because there's less to unpack for one partner than the other.
So was that true with women as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, again, that's kind of like just dealing with something that is so intersectional. It's hard to even make a monolithic statement on any of them because the experiences were so different. There's a couple where, it was a white trans non-binary partner and a Filipino partner. And one of them had left a very conservative Mormon upbringing. And just unpacking that in itself, even if it was a straight couple, is so intense and complicated, especially with like conversion therapy and so it's like those are all things that you're not going to see in a visual. And so I think that having those unexpected things exist in there was something that I was really hoping to happen, and I'm glad that did.
And there are a number of Asian relationships in the book, and their experiences are very different very often in the way they talk about whether it's a white partner or a not white partner, because I take it that their life experience is different, and especially depending on where they live or where they came from or where their families came from in Asia. When it was an Asian with another person of color, was that different than when they were with a white partner?
I think that it's all kind of individual, especially because, I think that it gets into that more complicated conversation of, white passing and kind of ethnic ambiguity and kind of the way someone's perceived lived-in experiences to what the actual reality is. So it's like, and especially me being a white person, I don't even feel comfortable even talking about it unless I'm specifically talking about something that someone shared, where I feel like it's not my place. And I think that, that's also why besides the introduction, why my voice is completely removed from it. And, yes, there's couples in the book that, especially with the amount of violence that has been happening against Asian people, that talk about it very specifically, especially because of just the time that we're in, it brought up a lot of stuff that maybe was pushed down for a while, especially when you have a partner that makes you feel safe, especially when you have a white partner that makes you feel safe. And feeling unsafe again when you're not with your partner because of what the current dynamic is something that I think a lot of people don't think about. And so I'm glad that it's part of that conversation. I'm not glad that it exists, but I'm glad that it's part of that conversation to maybe help people understand that, in private, you can feel really safe with your partner, and in public, when you're not with them, you can feel the most unsafe, and no one should have to experience that.
Would the book, and this is just hypothetical, of course, have been different if you had worked with a person of color who also was taking pictures at the same time? Would they have, in your view, the story that you're telling through the eyes of the people that you're photographing, your partners in this, would it have been a different story had you been a person of color, or if you were both shooting simultaneously?
Um, Absolutely. You know, I talk a lot about it when I do lectures now, and about kind of when an artist's voice is appropriate for whatever their endeavors are. And I think because, you know, it felt appropriate to me because I've had the lived in experience. I've had many very long-term and intimate interracial relationships that, you know, have influenced the way I look at the world. And, you know, I also talk to a lot of Black and Brown and Indigenous photographers while I was doing this. Some of a few of who are actually in the book, of that this is not a book necessarily celebrating being in an interracial relationship. It's not necessarily saying, this is what you should go and do. It's more like, this is what it looks like, and this is the, you know, the shit that we kind of have to work through to make our love work. And it's not necessarily easy, and it's definitely work, and it requires conversations, but we love each other in a way that that's important for us to do that. And yes, if, you know, if I was a trans photographer or if I was a Black photographer, one would be a different body of work. And two, any photographer is going to, you know, I always say what makes my work very different is that I make people very comfortable because of the way that I go about things. And in some ways, that's a privilege for me to be able to do that. But in other ways, it's very much because of my lived-in experience of not feeling seen and not feeling safe very often, being outed at a really young age. And, you know, I talk about some of those things in the introduction and how that's informed the way I view photography and how I do the work that I make. But yeah, absolutely, it would be a completely different thing if it was from, you know, a different marginalized experience.
Well, because in the introduction, you do talk about that this whole process was somewhat liberating.
Yes.
And freeing. And how does that contribute or impact your art?
It's just made me really look at things very differently in terms of like, I talked about earlier, just like, you know, growing up in Flushing and kind of being the only white person, and like then moving when I was in, you know, like 8 or 9 to a school that was mostly white, and Black and brown kids were bussed in from the neighboring neighborhood. And how my relationships have always been very colorful, and have had a very large spectrum, and I actually don't have a lot of white friends. And but it's also, it's made me not feel comfortable per se to be like, I don't photograph my friends, I don't photograph my loved ones, because in a lot of places I haven't felt like my voice was appropriate to be using their image. And now I feel like I really have a groundwork of understanding that the way that I am looking at the world and the conversations I'm trying to have are coming from a place of wanting to be a facilitator and not necessarily talking for other people or showing you know, communities that are not my own. I'm much more interested in the conversations that it leads to, because that's what's in my personal life and not my artistic practice, has what's made me grow and evolve exponentially as just a human being, and I have wanted to kind of figure out how to impart that into my creative practice. And I finally feel like that I have gotten into a very comfortable place of knowing when my voice is relevant, and also what I'm bringing to the table is very different than what historically white queer men have done.
No, that's interesting, because when I go through the pages, when I read the words, your statement in the photography is one that seems very much aware that you are capturing a very private moment. And although you don't seem in the photographs at all embarrassed about being there, you definitely seem very respectful.
Yeah, and that's you know, I always hate using it as an example, but it's the easiest one for me to do. It's like I always think about, you know, the difficult conversation of like talking about someone like Mapplethorpe and how he viewed and utilized Black bodies, and the way that it was taught to me in college is much different than the way that I now look at it from, you know, critical theory and understanding who he actually was as a person. And you know, and then looking at other photographers historically, it's like I didn't want to make the same mistakes, and I wanted to make sure that I respected not only the people that were choosing to collaborate with me, but the people that were then going to view it, for them to understand the amount of respect and understanding and ethics that are involved in making work like this.
And the long-term process to get there.
It's not something you can just pick up. And I always say what seems like the simplest thing is often the hardest thing to do. And, you know, you would think that, you know, just, oh, it's like, you know, photographing couples, they're in love, they're comfortable with each other. It's like, it's not something that you can just walk into. I taught a workshop on intimacy and photography over the summer, and I just started the class by saying, this is not something that I can teach you. It is very much about a lived-in experience and doing the work to get to the place of knowing who you are as a person and how you treat other people and how you interact with them and how that informs the way you make photographs. It's not something like you know, 1 + 1 = 2. It's very much having the experience of doing it for most of my career, that you come from it with a real place of care.
That is, I think, the way we should treat all aspects of our lives, with a lot of care. And I want to thank you for joining us. Our hour is pretty much up. Want to remind you that you're watching Stonewall National Museum Archives and Library live through Zoom and Facebook. And we're with Ryan Pfluger.
You got it. I know.
I'm so afraid that I'm going to say it wrong.
I know.
And the book is Holding Space, Life and Love Through a Queer Lens. And it is truly awe-inspiring when you sit there and you thumb through those pages and then read the people who are participating's words about the people that they're photographed with, and not being told the story in words from the photographer, but it is a partnership of words and photo. And knowing that it was shot during the period of COVID and in political turmoil, it really is extraordinary, because it gives you a certain calming feeling when you go through those pages, that even in turbulent times, there are peaceful places where we can be safe and where we can feel loved. Stonewall is hoping to do that by putting LGBTQ history in context and reminding us that American history, world history, political history is queer history. We are completely entwined, and in many places pushing that envelope so that the world can be and will be a slightly better place. And so please come and visit us here in Fort Lauderdale at the museum and library. Pick up Ryan's book. I believe that's in the chat. And join us next time, which will be April 18th at 11 a.m. on Zoom, when we talk with a group of displaced people living in a UN camp in Kenya, where they're being brutalized and marginalized, even worse than they were in Uganda or any of the other countries that they came from. It's a painful story, but one of resilience, how these people stand up for themselves, even under the worst oppressive situation. So thank you all for joining us. Ryan, it's been a great pleasure. And I look forward to the opportunity of doing this again with the next book. And certainly if you're in Florida, come and visit us and
I will.
And talk to our audience. So thank you all and have a very good night.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.